Quartered safe out here is George MacDonald Fraser's memoir of his experiences as a young soldier in the British Army during World War II's Burma campaign. Blending humor and stark realism, Fraser vividly recounts life on the front lines, capturing the camaraderie and harsh realities of war. Let's begin. When I was about 14, I sat 3 exams in mathematics and scored 27% in algebra, 10 in arithmetic, and 0 in geometry. It was below par even for me, and that third mark, in particular, rankled so much that I actually did some work for a change. I mastered the simpler theorems, pinned Pythagoras, and his corollary, to the mat, and became something of an authority on the angles within a circle. It did not get me within a rod, hole, or perch of passing lower mathematics, O-level, I suppose it is nowadays, but it was a fatal application just the same, or so I sometimes think, on the basis of if I had not done so and so, such and such would never have happened, which is a futile speculation at the best of times. Still, if I had not learned those circle theorems, I am pretty sure that things would have been different one night south of Pyobwe. We left the town in mid-April and spent the next 2 weeks jaunting peacefully down the road on the heels of 5th Division, who were clearing the way to Rangoon. According to one military history, they encountered only slight opposition, one of those phrases that cause me unreasonable annoyance because, while it may be slight to a historian, it certainly was not to the man on the spot, whoever he may have been. But whatever trouble they struck, we were a long way behind, taking in the scenery, which was increasingly fertile and occasionally jungly, lush and green in the hot spring sunlight after the arid paddy of the dry belt. It was as pleasant as a journey can be in the back of a rattling 3-ton truck when you have nothing to do but bask in the heat, punish the water shaggles, watch grandma's perspiring, and envy Stanley's ability to sleep like a babe with a Bren clasped upright between his knees and his head cradled on the flash eliminator. Monotonous it might be, but it beat the hell out of marching and fighting. Only very young soldiers and head cases object to boredom in wartime. Back in Ranchi, before the campaign began, I had been silly enough to remark to Parker that I was brassed off waiting to get into action, and he had grinned pityingly and replied, "You will not be saying that in a month or 2. Now, after Meiktilo and Pyobwe, I knew how right he had been, and understood 9 sections content as the long dull miles rolled slowly past. Although 5th Division was taking the strain, we dug in and stood guard at night as carefully as we would have done if we had been up front. The Japanese might have been thoroughly hammered at Meiktilo and Pyobwe, and their armies split and scattered, but they were still there, on both sides of a bridgehead no wider than the road itself, which 5th Division and ourselves were driving into southern Burma. High Command may have known how badly their military machine had been thrown into confusion, but we did not, and it was a dead certainty that they had more men in their 3 armies, spread from the Salween River in the east to the jungly hills of the Pegu Yomas in the west, than the 17th and 5th Divisions combined. So each night the road south of Pyobwe, for 100 miles and more, was a series of armed camps waiting to be counterattacked and taking no chances. Digging in was much easier now. In the dry belt, the excavation of a slit trench 4 feet by 4 by 2 had been a back-breaking struggle with pick and shovel against ground as hard as flint and full of stones, and the entrenching tool had been as much use as a teaspoon. Once Scramas, a skilled navvy among other things, had taken pity on my incompetence and plucked me one-handed out of my half-finished pit, completing it himself with huge smashing strokes of the pick. It is nothing to do with strength, Jock, it is knowing how to swing a pick, sister, and you have got no more idea than a parson's grandmother. Come out. In the softer dark earth of the south, even I could dig a pit in under an hour, and at one place where we stayed 2 nights, and the earth was a firm sandy clay, the section amused itself by constructing a network of tunnels connecting pit to pit, quite unnecessary, but fun to do. It was the best position we ever had, for there was a fine field of fire across flat open ground to the jungle edge, a nearby tank where we bathed, and our brigade box enclosed a little village on the road where we could get mangoes and the magnificent jungle bananas, which are a brilliant scarlet in color and 3 times the size of the ones you buy in supermarkets. Our pits were on the edge of the perimeter, facing west. Somewhere beyond the jungly fringe ahead lay the Pegu Yomas, where the Japanese were reportedly getting their breath back, and patrols had brought in rumors of enemy movement in that direction. We operated the normal 2-hour watches, and for added strength, a platoon of Jat machine gunners from the Frontier Force Rifles set up their guns between our pits. The Jats are a tough lot, from the Punjab, tall, light-skinned, and not unlike the Baloch hillmen of our brigade. Being originally from Central Asia, they looked as much like East Europeans as Orientals, with their narrow moustached faces and thin straight noses. Nick watched approvingly as they mounted their heavy Vickers pieces and took careful sightings across the open ground before setting the guns on what was called fixed line. The object was that, with the guns angled so that their lines of fire intersected, the gunners could simply keep their fingers on the button in the event of a night attack, and a blanket of fire that nothing could get through would cover our whole front. That will give the buggers a bellyache, John, said Nick, and the Jot Havildar grinned wickedly. Tick high, said he. Japanese walla come this way, bus. He fed a belt of ammunition into his Vickers, took a last squint along the sights, and accepted one of Parker's cigarettes, which he smoked in the approved sepoy fashion, the butt between the pinky and third finger of the clenched fist, the smoke being inhaled through the mouthpiece formed by the curled forefinger and thumb. A variation is to cup both hands together to form an airtight pocket, but either way will make your head swim, and you will not want to smoke for a week. It was nothing new to the section, but now several of them were moved to try it again, and the peaceful dusk was shattered by their gasps and retchings. Obviously one inhales more air, wheezed the Duke, but why that should make the dose more powerful, I cannot imagine. You would think it would dilute it. Christ, it is like smoking old socks and black plug. Croaked Watty, racked with coughing. It is worse than capstan full strength. You could get the habit, mind, said Grandmas, hawking and weeping. By God, it has got a kick to it. Daft buggers, said Nick, who smoked a pipe. Cannot see myself getting used to it, said Parker. Makes me wonder why I ever started the bleeding things. Never fancied them, myself, said Wedge primly. Save me money. Get hired, you clean living git, said Morton, having coughed himself to a standstill. You will just spend it on drink. Route marching in Blighty started me, I said. Everyone lit up at the 10-minute halts, and I felt out of it, so I began cadging fags and then buying my own. I will bet you took your time about buying, snapped Forster. Mean Scotch halfpenny. Come on, then, give us one. What the hell is this, Du Maurier? With a bloody cotton wool tip? That is a tart cigarette, man. Give it back if you do not want it, I said. Piss off and give us a light. Bloody hell, I might as well be smoking fresh air. Filtered cigarettes were rare in those days and considered a feat. Lung cancer, passive smoking, and health warnings were unheard of. Almost everyone smoked, and those who deplored the habit did so as much on moral as physical grounds. There was a sense, among the godly and school authorities and my aunts, that it was sinful, not because it fouled the atmosphere or damaged the health, but rather because it betokened a low character. It buggers your wind, conceded Watty, inhaling with satisfaction. You Ramas, you will never win Grasmere at the rate you are puffing away. Knackers, retorted Gramas. I will win Grasmere. Fags never done me any harm. I just smoke it in and fart it out, and I am in grand fettle. He demonstrated thunderously, guffawing, and those nearest recoiled in disgust. The Duke, still inhaling thoughtfully through his fist, ignored him. There must be a scientific reason why the mixture of air and smoke has such a wallop, said he. Something to do with the diffusion of gases, would not you say, Jock? Ask Gramas. He is the great diffuser. I am sure we did it in physics. What is Boyle's law? What's in a name? A boil by any other name would smell as sweet. He bloody whore. Is that your own? No, 1066 and all that. That just about sums up my education, said the Duke glumly. Christ, the things I have forgotten in 5 years. Used to know all about gases once, maybe I am thinking of Avogadro's hypothesis, whatever that was. He shook his head. I do not know why my parents bothered. 13 years of wasted time, apart from cricket. Do you know, I doubt if I could parse a sentence nowadays, and I am buggered if I know what a gerund is. Supposing I ever did. A gerundive is a passive adjective, but do not ask me to define either of them. As for bloody geometry, said the Duke, I cannot even remember what an isosceles. They are at it again, cried Forster. Listen to them. Educated fuckers, I do not think. Do not know their asses from holes in the ground, either of them. Showing off with all the shit they did not learn at their snob schools. He got up, stabbing an aggressive forefinger at the Duke. Listen, you clever clogs. You do not know anything worth knowing. You or that Scotch twit, hey, Jock, give us another fag, you stingy sod. He puffed it alight and blew smoke at the Duke. You should have gone to elementary school, you. Might have got some sense lathered into you. You think I did not get leathered? Asked the Duke. Forster made an unbelievable noise of derision. If you did, it did not teach you anything. Bloody tuck shops. I never saw a bloody tuck shop, but I have learned things you will never know. I can well believe it, drawled the Duke, and the tone and the look were like a red rag to Forster. He stiffened, spat, and leaned forward. Can you now? You are that bloody smart, are not you? All right, since you are so bloody full of science and shit, tell us, if you are driving a bus, And you cross your hands on the wheel, what happens? I have never driven a bus. No. Not you. Never worked in your fucking life. But I imagine you cross your hands to make a sharp turn. That is what you think, eh? What does happen if you cross your hands on the wheel, Foshy? I asked. You get fired. Sacked. Kicked out on your ass. His voice was shaking. All of a sudden, where I thought he had been merely needling, he was pale with anger. I know, because that is what happened to me. The fucking inspector saw us, and I got my cards, there and then. Out on the bloody street, November 7th, 1930 bloody 4. While you and the Duke were at your fucking posh schools, learning nothing and stuffing yourselves in tuck shop. On the bloody dole. But you, what the hell do you know about that? Abruptly he turned on his heel and threw himself down beside his pit, drawing violently at his cigarette. Grandmas raised his head, surprised. The Duke was chewing his lip. If any two men in the section detested each other, he and Forster did, but it had never been so open before. At the same time, there was that in Forster's outburst which gave the Duke pause. Forster sour, Forster sneering, Forster scrounging and subverting, we knew, but not Forster in a storm of bitter indignation. It is hell in the trenches, said Parker philosophically. Then the Duke said, in a quiet voice. That is a bit rough, I must say. They sacked you just for that? Aye. Just for that. Roof, by Christ. Well, said the Duke, I am sorry, Foshy, but I do not see what it has got to do with what we were talking about. No, you bloody would not. He was quieter, but still plainly full of bile. You do not have a wife and 2 kids and fuck all but the dole to live on. Give over, man, said Nick. Give over my ass. Stuck-up bastard makes me sick. The Duke sat up, slightly pink, and since Peel was not present, I brought the ponderous weight of my one stripe into play. Cut it out, Foshy. Forget it, Duke. Foshy, said the Duke, if you have got something up your nose, blow it out. It is not my fault you were on the dole. I never said it was. Forster rolled up on one elbow. But I will tell you this, Duke, if I had had your chances, I would never have been on the bloody dole either. I would have made something of my bloody self. Not like you, who never knew how well off you were. And bloody Jock there. All you two know is what you do not fucking know, the pair of you. He glared and turned away, grinding out his half-finished cigarette. For a man who had been known to crawl all over the truck looking for abandoned dog ends, this was proof of strong emotion indeed. The Duke opened his mouth and closed it again. Parker made a restraining gesture toward him and winked at me. Who is for a brew-up, then? What do you say, Jock? How about working your well-known magic and treating us to a fragrant steaming billy? All right, with my permission you will get a commission. Got the grub box there, Duke? Let us have a look at what we got, then, eh? It petered out there, as most section quarrels did that stopped short of blows, with the older hands changing the subject and the principals lapsing into tight-lipped silence, damp it down and let it lie. I brewed up, with Parker pattering, and presently the tensions disappeared. By the time we were on to the second brew, Forster was grinning sourly again and cadging another of my Du Mauriers, while the Duke, across the fire, was talking to Wedge and Stanley about K rations as opposed to compo. But from time to time, he would glance in Forster's direction. Finally, we turned in, which consisted of rolling up in our blankets beside our pits, but I was not like sleep at all. It was one of those tropic nights that travel agents dream about, warm and still, with a huge Burmese moon high in the deep purple sky, so silver bright that it lit up the perimeter and the whole open ground to the feathery jungle edge. With the Jot guns and their crews in among us, the perimeter was thick with blanket-wrapped bodies. Everyone was down except the men standing guard, 2 every 30 yards or so in their slit trenches, and the Jot duty gunners sitting by their weapons. I was having a last, unlawful, since it was after dark, cigarette, shielding the glow in my cupped hands, when a figure approached from the far end of our section position. It was the Duke, his blanket round his shoulders, picking his way through the sleepers. Cannot sleep, said he, squatting down. Too bloody riled. I should have pushed that griping sod's face in. Should not I? No point. He was just letting off steam. Yeah, in my direction, as usual. He is a needling bastard. I can do without it. He pulled his blanket closer. Anyway, I am buggered if I will tailor my conversation to suit him. What the hell did I say, anyway? If he could not see what had irritated Forster, there was no point in telling him. It would not have been easy, and I was not inclined to try. God knows. Maybe he has got a touch of malaria, he is looking pretty yellow. Who is not? Anyway, as a matter of principle, I want to finish our discussion. So say something educated to me, will you? I stared. Anything, go on. Have you been hoarding your rum ration? I wondered. No. I just want a minute's civilized conversation in which every other word is not fuck. So humor me. Or tell me to piss off, if you cannot be bothered. Anything will do, so long as it is not about the bloody army, or Burma, or Japs. Just for a moment, before, I was remembering school, and it was a pleasant change. Being curious, I asked, what school was that? Oh, you have never heard of it. The moon was on his face, and I saw the wry grin. Little place in the West Country, run by a retired Indian civil service walla who liked to imagine he was a housemaster at a big public school. He had us playing the Eton Field game, no kidding. But it was all right. He shivered, huddling in his blanket. Come on, for God's sake, conjugate something, or tell me the principal exports of Bolivia. Or the corn laws. Or valency tables. Any damn thing. He was in a curious state. If action had been imminent, I would have said he was edgy. It came to me that I really did not know the Duke at all. We were so used to his languid, damn you me lad style that it never occurred to us that there might be someone else behind it. However, if he wanted eccentric diversion. You mentioned isosceles triangles, will it do if I prove Pythagoras for you? Jesus, he said, the square on the hypotenuse. I will bet you cannot. I did it with a bayonet, on the earth beside my pit, which may have been how Pythagoras himself did it originally, for all I know. I went wrong once, having forgotten where you dropped the perpendicular, but in the end, there it was, and the Duke's satisfaction was such that I went on, flown with success, to prove that an angle at the center of a circle is twice an angle at the circumference. He followed it so intently that I felt slightly worried. After all, it is hardly normal to be utterly absorbed in triangles and circles when the surrounding night may be stiff with Japanese. When I confessed that was as far as my mathematical genius went, he seemed contented enough, and settled himself to sleep, having thanked me between yawns. I asked if he was not going back to his own pit, and he said he could not be bothered. You ought to have your rifle with you, I told him. Oh, do not get regimental on me, Jock, I am tired. He yawned again. Do you think Forster did get fired for crossing his hands on the wheel? Yes. He is not likely to forget it, either. Well, I did not fire him. What has he got against me? He has got something against everybody. Get your head down. I was just dropping off when he spoke again. Cannot stand him. Pity. He is a bloody good soldier, bar his belly aching. That was all I heard. For the next 4 hours, I must have been dead to the world, and when I woke, it was to the deafening rattle of a Vickers and people yelling. There was the inevitable split second of bewildered panic, and then I was rolling into my pit and grabbing my Thompson simultaneously, shouting for Stanley and his number 2. They tumbled in beside me, and Stanley got the Bren to his shoulder as we watched our front, not that we could see a thing, for the moon was down, and even the nearest pits were lost in the gloom. The guns of the Jats on either side were chattering, sending traces scudding out into the darkness, and then someone roared cease fire. And in an instant, there was nothing but the echoes dying away, a subdued call for quiet, and the drift of cordite. Suddenly a flare was fired, and then another, and we were staring out across the empty ground lit by the flickering crimson flares. But there were no Japs to be seen, no movement at all, and no sound but the puzzled muttering along the line of pits, and the clatter of the Jats changing the belts on their guns. We stood to until dawn, half an hour later, and when the light grew, someone spotted the body lying a few yards in front of the pit to our immediate right. It was the Duke. He had been cut almost in half by the Vickers fire. It soon became plain what had happened. Someone had got up to go to the latrine and, in the dark, had trod on one of the sleeping Jats, who had cried out, not loudly, but still loud enough to wake a third party, who had asked what was up. A fourth man had said something like, "It is just one of the Jats," and a fifth man, probably half awake, had misheard the last word of the sentence and exclaimed, "Japs." In an instant, someone else had shouted Japs. And there was a mad scramble for the pits, with the Jot gunners starting to blaze away, and at some point, the Duke must have come awake, remembered that he was away from his pit and his rifle, and made a beeline for them. Only it was pitch dark, and he had run the wrong way. I cannot be certain when we buried him, but I imagine it must have been the same afternoon. It was quick and simple, as usual. We dug a slit trench beside a line of bamboo saplings, the platoon gathered round, the blanket-wrapped corpse was lowered in on log lines, Long John read the burial service and saluted, and we shoveled in the soil. I should be able to describe the section's reaction, but I cannot because all my attention was taken up by Forster. He was one of the men on the log lines, and as he withdrew the cord and stood back, I saw his face, and the hair rose on my neck. He looked like a madman, glaring at the grave as he coiled the line, and when we dismissed, he stalked off a few paces and then turned back, mouthing and looking from one to the other of us. Then he started talking, in a bitter cursing stream, demanding to know why the burial had been conducted with such haste and with so little reverence for the dead, and without proper ceremony. I cannot reproduce what he said, possibly because it came out in a semi-coherent flood, and possibly because I found it shocking and unreal. If I were writing fiction, I might have a stab at it, if I did not dismiss the scene as too far-fetched, but I am recording fact, and that was how Forster reacted. Some things I remember, the phrase shoveled in as if he was cattle, and a furious demand to know what the Duke's family would have thought if they could have seen it, and more in the same strain. What the section thought, God knows. They just dispersed, and only Sergeant Hutton, presumably in an effort to quieten Forster down, assured him that in due time, the Duke would be properly reinterred in a military ceremony. Forster fell silent at that and presently moved off to one side, and Hutton left him to it. I was heartsick sorry for the man. He and the Duke had disliked each other as bitterly as men can, but they had seen a lot of hard service together, and their last exchange had seen Forster at his obscenely vitriolic worst. Now the Duke was dead, in circumstances far crueler than if he had bought his lot in a fight, and Forster was in a private hell of his own, made all the worse for his being the kind of hard man whose emotions are stark and simple, and not subject to rationalization. His remorse had come out in the only way he knew, looking for something to vent itself on, and finding the perfunctory burial, which, as he knew perfectly well, was standard procedure in a swift-moving war. Forster and his comrades had seen too much death to be outwardly moved by it, whatever they felt. His was the only reaction I ever saw which verged on the theatrical, and he had special cause. But there was nothing to be done but let him come out of it in his own time, and I was walking away when he turned and fell into step beside me. He seemed to have settled a little, but I was uncomfortably aware that he was still glaring and breathing hard. Why he chose my company, I do not know, unless it was that he felt I had been a particular friend of the Duke's, which I had not been, in fact. But abruptly he stopped, and I automatically stopped with him. He looked back at the grave, and then rasped out. "What do you think about it, then?" I answered with care. "It will be all right, Foshy," I said. "You heard Hutton, they will do it properly, later on." I should have left it there, I suppose, but I honestly felt compassion for him, and in my folly, I dropped an enormous brick on the road to hell. I can only say it was kindly meant, and his question had taken me by surprise. "Anyway," I blurted out. "He thought you were a bloody good soldier." He frowned at me, his lantern jaw working. "You what?" "The Duke. He said it to me, last night, just before we went to sleep. He said you were a bloody good soldier." He blinked, looked down at the rope still coiled in his hand, and then back at the grave again. For a long moment, he said nothing, and for no reason that I can think of, I took out my cigarettes and offered him one. He lit it with his hands cupped against the slight breeze, inhaled, blew out smoke, and gave me his most unpleasant grin, without any mirth in it at all. "Do not give me your shit, Jock," he sneered, and walked away. I have nothing to add, either in comment or attempted explanation, after 45 years. That is what happened, and that is all. That concludes the 9th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please consider subscribing for more episodes.